Symbiopsychotaxiplasm, Take 1, is largely defined by its unorthodox everything. This is a documentary slash social experiment. Who is the subject of the social experiment? Well, it's the cast and the crew of the movie, but it's also you and me and anybody who ever watched this thing. This is a movie that follows a film crew making another movie, or shooting screen tests for another movie, really. Now, we're not talking about sort of a typical behind-the-scenes documentary, in part because the movie they're making, it isn't Apocalypse Now, it isn't anything you would have heard of, and it isn't anything that was ever even finished. It seems more like a placeholder, and perhaps was never intended to be anything more than a conduit for making this odd documentary, which is really the end product and the main artifact, as much as it kind of doesn't seem like it in a way. The screen tests are mostly shot in Central Park. This is one of the most authentic New York movies ever made. Mainly, we watch the crew putz around and try to wind their way towards making a movie. At times, it is not obvious what this movie is about, either the movie in the movie or the movie itself, given its odd structure and the self-effacing and Ouroboros vibes. At the very least, though, you can probably say that this is a movie about making a movie that gives you a huge dose of what it's like to be on set, what it's like to be in a crew, about all the interesting relationships between the crew, the actors, the director, about the day-to-day struggle of labeling your reels of film, and also about the intellectual life these people lead as they work on a project that they may or may not be certain of, or may or may not understand entirely. Midway through the film, there's an extended scene of the crew talking about the movie that they're working on, without the director being there. They say a bunch of different things about the movie, and about the director too. Now, I didn't find much of what they said here directly to be insightful, but there's something really fun about seeing what all these guys have to say when the director isn't in the room, like hearing a class talk about a professor. There's a certain kind of groupthink that happens here, and it's interesting to see how these people intellectualize over this project that they're all working on together and might be confident about, or maybe not so much. You have a very particular sort of ownership here. I think you might know what I mean. Another big factor here is attention. People do kind of weird things when there's a camera around. And when the crew goes to film themselves talking about the movie, there's going to be a little bit of pulling for the spotlight. People want to speak their mind and be heard. They want to seem smart. This is an interesting contrast to the crew usually being totally out of shot, out of sight, and out of mind. If you work on a film crew, you probably accept from day one that the movie is not about you, but in this instance, it becomes about you. That's kind of interesting. Like I said, I'm not too interested in anything that any of these guys say. Some of the comments are somewhat insightful, some of them not really, but these scenes are fun. Now, there's also an interesting relationship between a movie itself and all the movies that came before. Hollywood, the industry, things like that. And you can feel here the production chafing under a pretty conventional script, a pretty conventional idea. It's a bohemian group, and I guess we're seeing the 1970s social upheaval play out here a little bit as they try to figure out where they should go with a script that they might find a little bit weak, and a concept for a film that's sort of amorphous. Now, is this movie saying anything more than this stuff about, what it is to make a movie? I think that's up for debate, and we'll talk about that a little later on. But even if you don't think so, even if you don't think it goes anywhere past that, this is still a pretty fun movie to watch. It has some twists. This seems like the kind of movie that you could never spoil, but there's a couple things I'm not going to tell you because there's some really fun moments towards the end. There's a lot to think about here. There's a lot, this is a movie with very conspicuous elements, and there's a lot to talk about. For instance, we get a lot of simultaneous shots in the movie where we see what 2 cameras or even 3 cameras are filming. The images are side by side by side. You might see this in a music video, but you're very rarely going to see this in a narrative film. Rare to see multiple simultaneous angles, and I think it almost kind of violates one of the main tenets of narrative film, which is the illusion that there's one seamless thread of action, that there's one perspective, that there's one place to look, that what you're seeing on the screen is what is happening. Even though you know that, in fact, it was spliced together, stitched together from many different takes, filmed maybe on different days, different places. If you're really paying attention, you might say, well, wait a minute. Isn't multiple simultaneous takes showing us what's really happening? Isn't that way more real than a narrative film? And generally, yes, it would seem, but to me, it sort of feels less realistic somehow. It breaks some kind of illusion I guess. It's sort of 2-3D. Maybe the problem is that in real life, we don't usually see things from multiple angles at once unless you're a cubist or something. And when you're watching the movie and they give you 2 angles to look at, you can't really see them both at the same time. You look over here and you look over there, and your brain is probably going to do some calculations. There's some mental labor to sort of understand what. So that's this guy from over there, but it's this guy from over there. There's a bit of resolving to be done. Maybe you're going to try and see, are these really in sync? And you're like trying to look at one and trying to look at the other, but you can't really have your eyes in 2 places at once. Okay, I'm not sure that makes sense, but the point is that these simultaneous sequences will make you think and have a deconstructionist tone to them as well. This movie has some things to say about what it means to edit, what it means to put together a film, right? How do you go from these sort of disjoint shots, same thing, same time, but somehow not really watchable, to one, cohesive narrative thing? So yeah, editing. How do you transform this aimless day of shooting in Central Park into a sequence? We also get a hint of the power that the editor has. This is a little cliched maybe, but William Greaves, the director and the editor, he edited the sequence where his crew talks about him, ostensibly behind his back, but ultimately everything's going to be filtered through him, and they know that. That's kind of interesting. The audio is another thing that points out how movies get put together. There are several moments in this movie where the audio is screwed up, broken, including right at the beginning of the movie. Sometimes we see the crew monkeying with their gear, or they're talking about how to fix it, and sometimes we hear the faulty sound in the movie itself. The beginning gives us a big dose of this faulty sound, and that's the lead into the opening credits, of the funky opening music, which still has the broken sound beneath it. They're really foregrounding the mechanical aspects of the film from the beginning, not that you're ever going to forget them while you're watching this movie. One of the interesting things about having multiple cameras rolling at once is that it doesn't always match up with what you hear, right? There's only one audio track. Maybe you got 3 cameras, but you've only got like 2 microphones. The audience isn't sitting where the camera is. They're not going to hear what's coming from there, and even if they could, hearing from 3 different positions at once would be slightly weird, although shout out to the film King Lear from Godard, which does exactly that and is extremely hard to follow for that reason. But anyway, the microphone is sometimes going to follow a character as they wander off screen. Or sometimes a character will be way in the distance, but you'll hear them like they're right next to you. When we're in this scene of the crew discussing things in the room together, there's a little bit of lag as one person starts talking, and then the boom mic operator presumably has to point the microphone over to them. So there's there's an interesting thing with the tension going on there, where you sort of have to get the talking stick to be to be heard. And somehow this conversation foregrounds maybe more than your average conversation, like what it means to be in a group of people and to get people's attention, right? To start talking and to be sort of taken seriously, and what that sort of talking stick, which is not a real thing, but is in fact a social construct of being listened to, being heard and seen, how that works is somehow captured a little bit in this, partly because of the way the audio works. Yeah. Sometimes the sound is a little bit baffling. It's just not entirely clear who you're listening to or what is going on. Okay, so another way to think about this, I guess, is that when we have multiple cameras, it creates this sort of 3-dimensional view of things in some ways, or it gives us some alternate sense of space, but the audio doesn't really follow that. We only have one focal point for the audio, and this collapses things down a little bit. I'm not going to get too carried away here, but like I said, there's plenty to think about regarding the odd style and the odd structure of the film. The last thing I'll mention in this category is that we have another interesting title. Now, forget about the first part and just look at the subtitle, for instance. Take 1. Okay, this movie is not all one take, don't worry. It's not very often that you see like such a clear nod to the mechanics of a film within the title itself. Would you go see a narrative film? Star Wars, Take 1. We couldn't afford more film. We tried our best. Here's what you get, right? Interesting to see what this subtitle is kind of getting at. Now, personally, I think that things are a little too on the nose with the title, maybe. There is an interesting balance between the title and the subtitle, the title being this big word, and the subtitle being something sort of modest. To me, I don't know, they felt like maybe they were both a little too on the nose. How could something so vague be too on the nose? Well, if you start breaking down the parts of the title, it becomes, I don't know, a little bit less fun. Anyway, is there anything more than this? Is there anything more than just kind of movies themselves? I mentioned that we're in Central Park, And you get a real sense of the place. It's interesting to see how similar it looks, but also how many things have been reworked. The benches have been taken out. If you don't live in New York, that's not going to be interesting to you, so I won't elaborate. There are a few nice encounters with people outside of the crew. They bump into a cop on horseback at one point. They bump into a group of high schoolers, I think, and they bump into a homeless artist. These encounters are almost more interesting than anything that the crew actually does, which is sort of telling. And in fact, the movie ends with the homeless guy, which is a hint about just how shapeless the movie is. That's not necessarily a fatal flaw, but it's telling. Relatively early in the film, Greaves says to the crew that everything they're doing should be keying in on sexuality. Does he say this as the director of a fictional movie? Is it, almost a satirical nod to modern directors trying to make movies about sexuality? Or is this the thesis of the documentary that we are watching? It's hard to answer that question one way or the other. I lean a bit more towards the former. We have some moments of sexuality in the film. The scene we see over and over in the screen test is about a wife confronting her husband over his homosexuality. I can't remember if they're married. This is interesting, kind of an old-fashioned plot line in some way. Sexuality kind of buried down in there somewhere, though, it would seem. There's a great moment where Don Fellows, one of the actors doing the screen test, he's actually the most famous actor that appears in the movie, and he at one point he's talking to Greaves and he's asking how campily he should portray this character, and they discuss it a little bit, and Fellows concludes, well, I'm just going to play him straight. And it's kind of a joke, but also a very incisive comment that was not scripted. Don Fellows really stood there in Central Park and squirmed his way into not engaging with this gay character at all. I think it's too late to cancel him. But what an interesting moment. Not scripted at all. Pretty incisive. The homeless artist at the end also had sexuality on his mind. And again, that's where they choose to end the film, with another unscripted moment. So maybe this is a bigger theme. There's hints of a theme here. But I think it falls a little bit short of being some kind of thesis, or being too incisive, I suppose. Generally speaking, I don't think that this movie can carry itself much past what we've already talked about. There are glimmers of themes. Another glimmer is the idea of playing characters. One of the crew accuses Greaves of playing a character. But this guy is himself hamming things up a little bit for the camera. And personally, I don't know. I wouldn't run too far with this idea, although maybe it's not too far away from what I alluded to earlier with all the relationships that spring up when making a movie. It is also interesting to see how the characters evolve. We see the scene again and again. We mostly see Don Fellows and an actress working on it, but we see other people playing the same characters as well. That's interesting to see same characters, different actors, another thing you don't see in most movies. Arguably, they're not the same characters because the characters are the actors doing the screen tests, whatever. You also see Don Fellows evolve his character, and you see the actress he's working with, how committed she is to things, and that's pretty interesting, seeing these actors on sort of a low-budget project in Central Park. Pretty serious in some ways, but not totally serious in other ways. There's some stuff here. This is a good movie for a reading group, I think, because you can come away from it with all kinds of ideas, and that's a virtue, but it's also a little bit of a risk. The Wikipedia article for this film has some terrible analysis in it. If you watch the movie, hey, be a little bit careful, because it's kind of easy to shoot from the hip, as I've been demonstrating for the last several minutes. Anyway, I like Symbiopsychotaxiplasm Take 1, but not at all for the reasons that I was expecting. I found it to be less incisive than I had thought, to be less intellectually engaging, maybe, but more fun to watch, more just kind of engaging, and more full of life. So maybe it's worth checking out for you.